politicians. And we haven't seen anything quite like this before the conquest. There's the Witan, of course, and there's the great earls. Godwin, Edwin and Morcar, these sort of spring to mind. But it's different. There's a far sort of greater level of complexity, of sophistication. And this is what we're looking at across the period, is this increasing level of sophistication. So we've talked about the Exchequer and justice and the collection of finances and the royal household and the chancery and the role of chief justiciar. Underpinning all of this, of course, is the introduction of feudalism. They don't call it feudalism at the time, as you know. And I've done another video where I speak about feudalism in more depth, but this is about this sort of looking at the looking at the country as a whole, and everything being connected again to the body of the king. This increasing degree of centralisation, and feudalism allows the kings to, of course, raise a huge amount of revenue through their feudal dues, to demand loyalty, hand out patronage. All of these things. It's about control. It's about centralisation. These are really the major functions of how government is developing at this period. Questions that you're likely to face are questions like, it's a terrible question, I think, but questions like, the Exchequer was the most important development in English central government in the period 1066 to 1216. How far do you agree with the statement? And of course, what this question is asking you to do is talk about the importance of the Exchequer. Then you might want to mention the Chancery, you might want to mention the Chief Justiciar, the importance of feudalism, the importance of justice. Explain each of them and then make a judgment as to which is the most important. You're always looking at, the examiners always want you to make a judgment, to have an argument. And I would argue personally it's pretty straightforward to say the Exchequer is the most important, because this is tied up with finances, and this, everybody else's role in this is all about getting finances into the Exchequer. But you could equally argue it any other way. Doesn't matter. It's a stupid question. I mean, who cares really? But you've got to argue it one way or the other, and just have that consistent argument. More interesting are questions such as the greatest developments occurred under the Normans, or greater developments occurred under the Normans than under the Angevines. How far do you agree? And then we're looking at, because we're looking across synoptically across the whole period 1066 to 1216, and we've got to look at picking out what develops happened when. So the easiest way to do this is to look at the two Henrys, because what we often see is Henry I instigating something and Henry II then developing it further. And of course Hubert Walter Richard adding more to the work of Henry II later. So that's a more interesting question. I think it's a more worthwhile question. And it's a really interesting one to argue. Is it under the Normans or under the Angevines that this happens? Are the Angevines simply building on what the Normans did, or are they more innovative? Really interesting to look, if you want to look at different interpretations of Henry I's reign, look at what Warren Hollister and what Frank Warren, two brilliant historians, what they both say about Henry I's reign and the level of innovation there, and they completely disagree, and it's fascinating to read these. That may have even been the question on last year's paper. That might have been the interpretations question, might have been based around their two interpretations of Henry. But that's interesting. The most difficult of all the questions I've seen, and therefore also the best, is the question, there was more continuity than change in central government in the period 1066 to 1216. How far do you agree? That's a tricky question, because we're looking at, if you look at the Exchequer, for example, obviously the Exchequer is more or less continuous throughout the period, but it changes in its level of complexity. The role of Chief Justiciar and Chancellor, these change across the period. This is requiring really a greater degree of knowledge, I feel, that question, but it's one way, if you are able to answer that question, that you can really smash out a really high level answer, I would think. So just